Straight Edges, Chapter 9, You Will Be Like God, Part 2. Even without using the Bible as a starting point, could we arrive at any hypothesis for the origin of evil, given the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God? I've wrestled with this question for days at a time. If God created everything good, how is evil possible? If evil wasn't made, where did it come from? The first thing I could see after beating my brains against it for a few days is that evil has only a negative existence. Darkness may be comparable to evil. Darkness has reality, certainly, but its reality is purely negative. It's only the absence of light. Of course, when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and there are 3 long hours between you and daylight and sleep is fled for the night, the darkness can seem very big and very powerful and very overwhelming. But what happens to darkness when the sun rises? Where does it go? It doesn't go anywhere. It never really was all on its own. It exists only because light exists. Evil, like darkness, has no original nature. It has no existence apart from good. The absence of good is evil, or good misplaced becomes evil. Evil is always only a lack, or a perversion, or a corruption, or a twisting of something good. Let's try an experiment. Name something that you consider evil. Isn't it made possible only by the existence of something good? The good thing had to come first. What about war? Life had to exist before death could exist. Death is the absence of life. Life had to exist before it could be taken in war. And war can only exist because there's a right and a wrong and two sides are disagreeing about which is which. Right had to exist before wrong could exist and before anyone could disagree about them. As John Milton wrote in Paradise Lost, where there is no good for which to strive, no strife can grow up there. Murder? The wrongful taking of a human life? Again, life had to exist and right had to exist before any life could be wrongfully taken. After I thought about it for a while, I could see that evil need not have been a created thing because it's a lack or a misuse or a misplacement or a corruption of something good. But I couldn't figure out how that corruption was possible in the first place. I mulled over a few more specific evils. Lying? Just a skewing of truth. Truth is the good thing that had to come first. Sexual perversion? A twisting of a good thing. Greed? Too much of a good thing. Pride? Hey, what about pride? It's sometimes called the original sin. What good thing could pride have been originally? After thinking it through, I realized that pride and conceit really don't have any counterpart for good in us. There is nothing in us that was originally a good form of pride. We talk as though it can be a good thing. Take pride in yourself. You deserve the very best and all the rest. But when we meet someone who has taken that advice to heart and thinks he's numero uno, we don't find it a very pleasant trait, do we? We don't mind our own various little conceits, but none of us appreciates them in anyone else. We talk about being proud of someone else like it's a good thing, but that's because it's a very different thing than being proud of oneself. In a sense, being proud of someone else is the opposite of true pride, which, by its nature, is self-focused. Another term we could use for pride is selfishness, because the two are essentially the same. Pride says simply, me, me, me. Normally, the vice is the negative of the positive virtue. In the case of pride, it's the other way around. Humility is the negative. Humility is the lack of pride rather than pride being the lack of humility. It's the same deal with selfishness. Unselfishness is simply the lack of selfishness. Pride and selfishness are positive, not negative realities, it would seem, not incidental but original. We could argue that all evils grow out of this one root, isn't it true? You name it, if it's a bad thing we do it because we're listening to the voice in our heads that's shouting, me first, I'm going to do what I want to do, me, me, me. But isn't it odd that pride seems to have something of originality about it? If God created everything good and all the other evils are uncreated parasites of good, where did pride come from? It couldn't have sprung up on its own because it appears to have been cut from whole cloth, made from original material. These are the ideas I was turning over in my head for days. I couldn't find any way to account for the original nature of pride. There was no place for pride in all of God's creation. Then from out of somewhere an answer occurred to me. If evil is only misplaced good, and pride, being evil, must have its proper place, there is only one place possible where pride could not be evil. Only we would never call it pride in that place. See, what we are really saying through our selfishness, what we really mean when we inwardly shout, me, is, I will be God. If I can't be the God of any other thing, I will be the God of me. Remember earlier, the definition of God came up as the one in control. If we can't control any other thing, at least we want the final control of our own lives. And that is how I would define pride, the decision to be God, even in a small way, even just of me. It's a matter of the will and of pitting our wills against God's. But is it wrong? Is it evil for God to decide to be God, to want to be number one? Of course not. He really is numero uno. He really is the one in control. He is God. But for anyone else to say to himself, I will be God, and usurp his maker's rightful place in his life, it is evil and breeds every other kind of evil. So I saw in a flash that what in us is pride is not made of original material either. It too is only a misplacement. Its proper place belongs to God and only God. If anyone says to himself what is right for God alone to say, it becomes pride and evil. But what's so bad about wanting control just in my own life? Isn't it more evil to want to control someone else? Why would a good God seek to control us? Why shouldn't we all have control over our own lives, you might be asking at this point. I'll put the questions in your mouth because they were the exact questions in my mind as I was thinking through the question I asked you earlier. Is it wrong for God to decide to be God? Why would a good God seek to control us? Trying to answer that question will lay the final piece into place in our hypothesis for the origin of evil, but we'll get there in a moment. Why shouldn't we all have control over our own lives? That's a harder question for me to answer. I suspect a kink in my own nature as being the thing that makes it a hard question to answer. When I told you in Chapter 5 that the majority of us does not want there to be a God, I wasn't putting you down if you happen to belong to that majority. I happen to belong to it myself. There's still a part of me that does, at any rate. The majority who resents the existence of God is a vast majority, as in all of us. The truth is, by nature, none of us wants there to be a God. What's my authority for saying so? Just the authority of being human and having a human nature to peer into. When I peer in, I'm afraid I can still see that kink I mentioned. I also can't help seeing it in the natures of everyone I know. We're all control freaks. All of us have that little voice on the inside that shouts, me first. Me. There's a piece of all of us that wants control. All of us want the final say in our own lives. It's only by an act of grace that I could also tell you truthfully in Chapter 5 that I now want there to be a God. That act of grace is available to all, but that's a subject for another chapter. But back to, why would a good God seek to control us? Is it wrong for God to decide to be God? No, God is God. But although I admit that God is God, that God is the one in control, I find that the only answer I can come up with to the question, why would a good God seek to control us, is this astonishing one. He doesn't. And with that answer, the last piece for a hypothesis for the origin of evil falls into place. And what I see when that last piece falls into place is not only a piece with a straight edge, but a piece that begins to reveal to me a little of the beauty of the big picture. Though God is the one in control, God is also love. And remember that love must be free. Love can only be the result of choice freely made. So God chooses not to control us against our wills. Because He is love, He chose to create creatures of free choice. Creatures capable of existing outside of His control, not of His ultimate control of the world, because He cannot be any other than God. But He could create creatures that He could choose not to control unless they chose His control. If any love between Himself and those creatures was to be possible, that was how it had to be. They had to be free. Why do we see it as an evil when one person seeks to control another? I believe because that kind of behavior is not love. Love does not strive for control. Love frees. Love gives choices. Because love is not selfish. We don't find the attitude that shouts, me, displayed in love. And interestingly, neither do we find that kind of attitude displayed by God, at least not the God of the Bible. Though he is God and he is in control and he is numero uno, we do not find God shouting, "Me first, me." We'll see that in the chapters to come. Love says to the beloved, "You first, you." In the famous love chapter of the Bible, we find in a summation of what love is that love does not insist on its own way. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 5. If God is love, then we could very properly trade God for love. God does not insist on his own way. Love says, "Not what I will, but what you will." See Luke 22, verse 42. If I'm not speaking rank blasphemy here, I believe in one sense that this is the very thing God says to the creatures of free will that he made. And that is the only hypothesis I have for the origin of evil. It was not God's will, his desire, that evil should exist, that the story would go the way the story has gone, but because of the nature of the love that he is, he refused to impose his will upon us. In a bizarre twist of plot, when looked at right side up, the existence of evil, the one reason many reject the idea of a loving God, is yet just one more pointer towards God is love. Now, to get back to that question, I found harder to answer, why shouldn't we all have the control over our own lives? Let me share some thoughts that helped me down the road to an answer. It struck me on thinking through this subject one time that from our own experience, we know that love and altruism are not precisely the same. Love does, in fact, look for payback. It does look for a reward. But the reward it looks for is just the delight of loving and being loved. Love does seek its own happiness, but the happiness of the one who loves is all wrapped up in the happiness of the one loved. To love another is not to hate oneself. Love doesn't deny self for the sake of denying self. It denies self for the sake of another. It realizes that the only path to finding oneself is to lose oneself in another. Love is not selfish, but neither is unselfishness an end in itself for love. The opposite of self-centeredness is not just unself-centeredness, it's other-centeredness. The opposite of selfishness is not just unselfishness, it's relationship. The opposite of pride is not just humility, it's love. Why shouldn't we all have control over our own lives? We do. All of us want the final say in our own lives, and lo and behold, we have it. God gives it to us because he is love. But when I decide that I must be in control of me, why must that decision be a wrong one? Why must that choice be an evil one and the root of every other evil that exists? Why couldn't I choose to have control over my own life but still make good choices? Why does it seem, from looking at our world, that the decision to be the God of myself will and must end badly? Things will end badly for me unless I willingly turn over the controls to God, unless I admit that he is God and I am not, unless I give him his rightful place as the God of my life, unless I say to him, "You first, you," unless I say, "Not what I will, but what you will." Why? Because of love. When I begin to see that this is the kind of love that God is and that he extends to us, I have an easier time understanding why I must respond to him in kind. I must at least begin an attempt at this kind of love for him. Anything else only adds to the mess. Whether we see it or not, I believe that I must be in control of me grows out of I want what I want, me. And if love is the opposite of pride and relationship is the opposite of selfishness and other-centeredness is the opposite of self-centeredness, then pride, selfishness, and self-centeredness by their very natures can produce only evil in the end. They stand opposed to the nature of God, which is essentially other-centered and relational. He is love, and the opposite of God could only be evil. That's why we find that evil is a negative, because God could not and would not, if he could, create evil to give people the choice between good and evil. Though choice must be given in order for love to be free, the only choice to be made was God or not God. God over self or self over God. It's all the thousands of years of not God choices that history bears witness to. But doesn't God want us to give him the controls? Won't he take control if we give it to him? Yes, he will. That is the ideal state where I want to end up, with God in control of me. We see from parent-child relationships that things go well only when the proper person with the right credentials is in charge, but things also go well only when the submission of the other party is a willing one. Only He is God. Only He is all-wise, all-powerful, and all-loving. Things go well only when He is in control. But He will only take control of me if I choose. So when He's in control of me, His control over my life is what both of us want. It's a decision both of us made, and that state of affairs means that I am still free. From personal experience, I can tell you that when God is in control, He is not controlling. He still believes in freedom, hence the reason Christians can look very messy. I've said that evil was not a created thing. We can see how evil could exist without being created if it began as the usurping of God's rightful place. I've said God does not desire evil to exist. If He created humanity for the sole purpose of having His love returned, we can see that evil is not His desire. I've said that God allows evil. There had to be a real choice. It had to be possible to choose, not God. Evil is the byproduct of that real freedom. I've said the way He chose to do things was the best way possible. I think we could see that the gift of love freely given is a thing of far greater value than anything. It must be worth it to Him, even to us. Remember that the human race goes on having offspring. I've said that in the end, good will swallow up the evil for those who choose God. We can admit it's a theoretical possibility, considering the negative character of evil, although imaginatively we don't see how it can be. That's because we're stuck at 3 o'clock in the morning, lying awake, wondering if the night will ever end. There are other hypotheses put forward to explain the existence of evil, one being that it doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. Let me make it very clear that this is not the position I've been propounding in this chapter. It's a very different position from the assertion that evil is real, though negative. Evil and good are not essentially the same thing, not just two sides of the same coin, as some say. Although evil has a negative reality, it is the opposite of the good. Evil is not just good disguised, although God brings very good things out of the consequences of evil, but evil is evil. God brings good out of its consequences, but the thing itself must be destroyed. There is nothing redeemable about evil itself. Don't we all feel this ourselves with the justifiable anger we have towards what is evil? That is, someone else's evil? Another idea that tries to account for the origin of evil is called dualism. Dualism says that there are two equal and opposing forces, and the good is not responsible for the evil at all. In other words, to go back to our old conundrum, the road taken is that God is not all-powerful. There is an evil force just as powerful. This may get us around the old conundrum, but it doesn't fly, for the reason which we've discussed, that evil has a derivative nature. Good and evil just do not seem to be equals. There is no creative power about evil. It's always destructive. It always takes something good and ruins it. As Frodo said once upon a time in Middle-earth, the shadow that bred them can only mock, it cannot make, not real new things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs, it only ruined them and twisted them. If there are two powers, it looks very much to me like the good power, aka God, must have been the original and creating power, and the evil power, we'll get there in a minute to find out what the evil power is also known as, is the derived and created power. Now that we've hypothesized together about the origin of evil, let's turn to the Bible and see how our hypothesis lines up with what the Bible teaches. I've focused our hypothesis mainly on the origin of evil at our level, but we could start by seeing what the Bible says about the original origin of evil. It didn't start with us. Dualism is right on the money in one regard, according to the Bible. The Bible does indeed teach that there is an evil power out there, and He, like God, is not just a force or a principle, whatever that means, but a person, a mind. This lines up with what we've reasoned about God being too powerful to allow accidents into His creation. What we see from our experience as malevolent is a purposeful malevolence. Otherwise, if the evil is not purposeful, that brings us back to the discarded option of accidental evil, and God not being powerful enough to keep accidents out of His creation. If the evil force is purposeful, then the evil force is personal. Only persons can do things on purpose. But the Bible also teaches that God and the evil power are not equals. It gives us clues as to the origin of the evil power. He was a created being, a being created good, but a being who became evil through his own gift of free will. What I've been hypothesizing in this chapter lines up very closely to what the Bible has to say about where evil came from in the first place. Coincidentally? No, I cheated by looking at the answers in the book. There was a power created good that turned evil by deciding, I will be God. By deciding it was better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, as John Milton wrote. As a result, that evil power is very desirous to do what it can to destroy us. The mess and disorder that is part of our reality is no accident. There is a bully standing over us, sneering. And I believe we have an eyewitness account in the Bible to tell us, or at least throw out a few veiled hints, as to how it all happened. The Bible doesn't say very much about the origin of this evil power we call Satan or the devil, and the rest of the demons or evil spirits. It has plenty to say about their existence, as well as the existence of other good spirit beings called angels, but not much to say about their origin. We can know that they are all created beings. If they weren't created, then they've always existed, but only God is eternal, 1 Timothy 6:16. The Bible also states that there were angels who fell from their proper place, and then it gives us glimpses into how the whole thing happened. 2 Peter 2 verse 4 says, For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. And also in Jude 6, And the angels who did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. Isaiah 14 talks about someone it calls the king of Babylon, and was no doubt written about the king of Babylon, but if you look into it, you'll find that a lot of what's in the Bible has more than one meaning. It seems very likely that Isaiah 14 is a picture of how Satan turned evil. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn! How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low! You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Isaiah 14, verses 12 to 14. Take Ezekiel 28 as another hint. Very much the same idea as Isaiah 14, only written about a different person, the king of Tyre. It says this, Because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a god, I sit in the seat of the gods. Yet you are but a mortal, and no god. You were in Eden, the garden of God. With an anointed cherub as guardian, I placed you. You were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created until iniquity was found in you. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. Ezekiel 28, verses 2, 13, 15, and 17. Again, a fall through pride, the decision to choose self over God, the decision, I am a god. The point of all my hypothesizing earlier was to point out that love must be free. God made us free to choose him, to choose to love and obey him, or to choose against him. Does this hypothesis for evil's origin work when we're talking about spirit beings? Were angels created with the gift of free will as well? I think from the hints we've seen about Satan being a fallen angel who thought he could be God that, yes, it is pretty clear that angels have or had free will too. But there are differences between humans and angels that we see in the exercise of their free wills. By way of illustration, let's think about servants and kids. Angels are God's servants, the Bible tells us, Hebrews 1 verse 7. Humans are his kids, John 1 verse 12. Both servants and kids have free will of a kind, but they are different. A servant's free will is more of an absolute kind. Certainly a servant can choose to defy and disobey his master once. Kids do it all the time, but because there is a different relationship and a different responsibility, kids are not expelled from the house. Kids decide daily that they're going to be masters of the house. But for a servant to decide one time that he's going to be the master, well, you see how it is. That decision can't be reversed. If an employee plots to take over the company from the CEO, are the two of them going to be able to work together? One will have to go. Rebellious and disobedient kids can be redeemed. Rebellious and disobedient servants can't. That's an illustration that makes sense to me anyway. If it helps you, well and good. If not, it's just an illustration. Facts are what count. And I think there's good evidence for the fact of the fall of some of God's servants through their own pride. At least the Bible calls it fact, and I have no reason to think it's not. True, angels and demons and Satan are not part of my straight edges. Their existence is not something I would have figured out for myself just by looking around at my piece or two of reality. But if anyone right now is saying to himself, don't tell me anyone seriously believes in supernatural beings, angels and demons and a devil and so forth, it's all complete nonsense, I'd be curious to hear his reasoning. Likely it would go something like, Well, because there just couldn't be any such things, that's all. No adult of normal intelligence could believe in them. It's feeble-mindedness. Person might as well believe in fairies. So, in effect, what that person would be telling me is that nothing could exist unless he knows about it, and if he doesn't know about it and hasn't experienced it, it can't possibly exist. But remember those far-off galaxies and those deep-sea creatures we haven't discovered yet? A great many things found, or not found yet, in nature are stranger and more fantastical than this idea of spirit beings. But it's called education, unless a person wants to admit that he could never learn anything else because he, at present, knows everything he ever will. Such a person must at least leave room for the possibility of the existence of spirit beings. As a matter of fact, I don't happen to believe in fairies. There's a reason for it. I've never met anyone who seriously claims to believe in them. I don't know anyone who's ever seen one. There's no reliable source telling me there are fairies. However, if a person I knew well and knew to be trustworthy, who had never told me a lie about anything else, and who I knew didn't do any kind of hallucinogenic drugs, confided to me seriously that she had seen fairies dancing in a ring under the moonlight, I'm afraid I would be at least bound to consider her claims and be open to the possibility of their being true. Especially in a case such as the one at hand, where we can look around us and see the results the bully has had on our world, it does seem more reasonable to believe in foul play, in some kind of purposeful and therefore personal evil power out there, particularly as a reliable source that I've never found to lie about anything else seriously affirms such a belief. So far it looks to me as though evil was uncreated but possible because of free will. Then I can see that pride, the decision, I will be God, was very likely the start of it all. And there does seem to be an evil power at work in the world. We can hypothesize that this evil power started off good and fell because of pride. And so far the Bible only confirms observation. But where did it go from there? Why does it affect every one of us now? Let's bring it down to our level next. What does the Bible say on the subject of humanity's fall? In Genesis 3, we find the first man and the first woman living in idyllic peace in their perfect garden, but they have two problems. One is a tree they've been commanded not to eat from. It's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the other is a snake in the grass, or perhaps in the tree. Neither of these would have been problems if the first man and woman had gone on making good choices, but a certain someone convinced them it would be a good idea to eat from the tree. He lured them, interestingly, with this promise: "You will be like God." Genesis 3, verse 5. And the first man and woman gave in. Oh, right, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. Does anyone still really manage to swallow that whole bit about the magical tree and the talking snake and all the rest? Not quite. I don't believe the tree was magical. I believe it was the act of committing evil, choosing the way of "I must be the god of me," that opened the eyes of the first man and woman to the difference between good and evil and got the whole ball rolling and the works gummed up. Then I don't believe in talking snakes. I believe that the evil power, who has demonstrated himself in his dealings with humanity to be a very able communicator, took on the form of a snake, a beautiful creature at that time, to approach the woman. So the woman expressed no surprise that a snake was speaking to her. So what? Everything was new to her. As to all the rest, see reasons for believing in angels and demons. Do I know everything there is to know? I have no problem believing that God made the first man and woman and made them perfect. So if I can believe the creation account in Genesis, I would have to admit that I can have no idea from my own knowledge what the world was like back then. I can guess that it looked pretty different from our world now. But why a tree? The whole thing just sounds ridiculous. Why would the first prohibition be against eating the fruit from some tree? What could be so bad about that? Remember that God cannot create evil, and evil had not entered the earth yet. There was no big bad sin for God to prohibit. I mean, this was a big bad sin. We just don't see it from our perspective, nor did the first humans. But to decide that I must be my own God is always big bad sin, none bigger and badder. Why would the first prohibition be against eating fruit from some tree? I see some awesome symbolism happening here. Remember that food is life to us. It's a life source we're all dependent upon. It seems to me that the choice offered the first humans was, will you choose dependence on me as your life source, or will you choose not God, independence from me? I must warn you that the second choice is no life at all. It's death. But, you say to me, of course they were going to eat from the tree they weren't supposed to eat from. It's only human nature. Give someone a prohibition and you're asking for trouble. Why would God have to give them this prohibition? Wouldn't he know they'd be bound to break it? It's almost like he created evil by creating a prohibition. Well, you're thinking from our point of view. You and I were not born into a perfect new world. We were born into a fallen world where every one of us seems to have a kink in our natures. Forbidden fruit seems sweeter to us because of something gone wrong in our appetites. As to why God would give them a prohibition in the first place, remember that love and obedience to God has to be a matter of choice. The evil power tries to make us see God giving us prohibitions as God taking away freedom. The exact opposite is the truth. If freedom is simply the ability to make choices, then without some form of prohibition for the man and woman to obey or disobey, there were no choices. They were not, in fact, free. Of course, there are many who believe the Bible without taking the first few chapters of Genesis literally. They would see this account as kind of an allegory to explain how evil entered the world. They would take the principles literally and take the rest as poetry. For reasons time will not permit, I do take the first few chapters of Genesis literally, but that doesn't need to be our issue here. What I hope you can see is that what we've been hypothesizing about the origin of evil from our own reality is not a far cry from the principles found in Genesis 3 about the choice the first humans made. And the results of that choice and our own we see all around us every day.